Hello and welcome. I'm Alex Vatanka. I'm the director of the Iran program here at the Middle East Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's event on the topic of Iran's future relations with the Gulf state if there is no new nuclear agreement. Let me just set the scene. We can discuss why this is the case, but at the moment, the likelihood of a new nuclear deal looks pretty small. The US and the Europeans do not think Iran's leader, Ali Khamenei, is really interested in signing a new deal. Tehran counters that it wants a deal, but it wants real economic benefits and not just the promise of some limited sanctions being lifted. If the diplomatic track completely collapses, what is Iran's plan B? What can we anticipate to see from the Biden administration in terms of an American plan? And as frontline states in a new possible US-Iran cycle of escalation, how would the Gulf states secure their interests? We have a wonderful panel of experts to discuss these questions with us. In the interest of time, I will introduce them alphabetically and briefly. You can see their full bios on the website. First, we have Mohammed Al-Sulami, who is the founder and president of the International Institute for Iranian Studies, Rasana in Riyadh. Then we have Norman Rule, who served for 34 years in various senior roles at the CIA, including as National Intelligence Manager for Iran from the year 2008 to 2017. And Norman remains deeply involved as an advisor on Iran-related projects at various institutions. We were also hoping that Mrs. Azadeh Zamirirad from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs would join us today. Azadeh has unfortunately fallen ill and is unable to take part in today's panel. We wish her a speedy recovery and look forward to have her join us at another occasion. At MEI, we strive for gender balance on our panels, but there is simply no time this morning to find a replacement. Just a few pointers from me before we start. To submit your questions, please use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone or watching on our panel on live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please email also events@mei.edu. Feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. I'll be looking for your questions throughout and factor in as many of those as I can. With all that said, let me turn to the panel. Norman, Mohammed, thank you very much for joining us. Looking forward to the discussion. Norman, let me start by asking a general question of you. What did you make of President Biden's trip to the Middle East? And in fact, would you also maybe comment on President Putin's visit to the Middle East? I just want to sort of see this stage being set by you and then have Mohammed give us a regional perspective. Did anything change on the Iran nuclear front in terms of US position, how to counter the Iranian challenge in the Middle East? Norman, to you.
Good morning, Alex. It's great to see you. And it's always wonderful to see Mohammed, and I send my best wishes to Azadeh's for her speedy recovery. She always brings a lot to panels. I think beginning on the president's trip in Saudi Arabia, I think it told the world two specific things. First, I think it said that the United States remains the preferred choice of security partner for the region. Multiple countries came together to meet President Biden and to discuss what they need for their security, for their economic and political success, and how the U.S. could participate in that. At the same time, it demonstrated that the United States wishes to be not only engaged in the region, but also sees Saudi Arabia correctly and appropriately as an extraordinarily important partner, and a partner with which it's impossible not to achieve the major issues in the region without Riyadh's participation. So there's a bit of a reset of the relationship, but really it shows the two sides are appropriately talking. That does not mean that there is agreement on the Iran issue. Indeed, I think we saw from the press statements that there still remains a divide. I'm not sure that the Gulf states, Jordan and Egypt, believe that a nuclear deal really provides them with the security benefits that the U.S. And the P5 would assert. At the same time, I think the region is still looking for a what's the plan after the nuclear deal negotiations fail. Now, if you move this to Tehran with the visit of President Putin and the visit of President Erdogan, I think you see three very problematic actors who are sometimes competitors, who are in sort of a loose confederation of issues that brought them together. But I think these three players were also signaling a message to the region that they have alternatives: economic, political, and security that could be developed if they are excluded from any, if their equities are excluded or attacked in any U.S. regional power reconfiguration.
Thank you. Norman, very quick follow-up from me in terms of the timing of President Putin's visit to Tehran. Would you think that was in response to President Biden's trip? Because, I mean, the idea of Iran, Turkey, and Russia talking about events in Syria has been on the cards for weeks now. So perhaps this trip was just a coincidence in terms of timing. It happened in the same week. But would you think there was a direct correlation between the Biden visit and how Putin timed his arrival in Tehran?
There's no evidence that the trip was planned per se. However, the president's travel to the region was widely discussed. It was widely known, and the issues that were to be discussed in Tehran, although relevant, particularly the grain discussions, it does appear as if this was meant to be a signal to the region, and I think it's probable that we should look in the direction of that it was indeed a coordinated effort to send that signal after the gathering in Riyadh.
Thank you. Mohammed, same question to you. How was just tell us from where you're sitting in Riyadh, obviously the president's visit to Saudi Arabia. Please also react to anything you heard Norman say, your take on what is going on.
Thanks, Alex, for the invitation, and pleasure to be with you and with Norman. And I wish, of course, as a very speedy recovery. Of course, the topic has a background in it. For example, the image of the United States in the region since like 2 or 3 years has been ups and downs. And of course, the big media campaign about the American withdrawal from the region and the focus on the Pacific and China, and of course, the withdrawal of some batteries from Saudi Arabia has a very negative impact on the image of the United States in the region in general and in Saudi Arabia in particular. This visit tried, in my opinion, to treat this damage, I would say, in the best way. And of course, we have heard that Biden said it was wrong for us. I'm trying to paraphrase, his statement, not quoting him, but it was a wrong decision to withdraw from the region and wouldn't come back to our commitments in the region, in the Gulf and in the Middle East in general. And we don't want to leave a gap for Russia, China, and Iran. And of course, from my perspective, and of course, many people in the region, it's from our perspective that it's wrong to put these three countries together, because our dealing with these countries are different. With China and Russia, we have a good relations, especially with China, and of course with Russia, with the exception of Syrian crisis and the Russian involvement in China and Russia. Iran case is different because it has its own proxies, it has own militias, which is we can't compare it to China and Russia. This is one. Second, of course, the outcome of the summit has its own, of course, I would say positive reception among Saudis and the Gulf in general. So that's yes, the United States is coming back. They want to look after their interests first, and then to go back to their partners or what allies, whatever you call it, in the region. And of course, many different issues have been discussed. Of course, the big question here is this a tactical move or a strategic move? This is, if it's a strategic move from United States, that's okay, let's go back to the roots of the relation between, for example, Saudi Arabia and United States, and the period we had like last decade or so is an exceptional. So we want to go back to the pillars of the relation between Saudi Arabia and the Gulf in general and United States. That will be very welcomed, and people hope, yes, it is the case. But if it's like a tactical issues that because of the coming midterm elections, inflations, fuel prices in the United States, then what happens afterwards? So I think these main questions. Of course, Iran case was widely discussed, whether in the Saudi U.S. summit, Biden and the King and the Crown Prince, or the GCC bilateral meetings with Biden, and of course the +3, and of course we had three final, what they call it, final concluding statements. In these final concluding statements, Iran was there, but of course when it's compared like the summit, the GCC +3 and the United States final statement is different from the other statement, was only GCC countries and United States. So you can see the differences in terms of the way they look at Iran. So this, maybe during the webinar, we'll discuss it more. In terms of the visit of course, Putin to Iran and the summit of Iran, Russia, and Turkey, nothing can be considered as an accident, something that just, it's happened like this. It was not scheduled. Even if it wasn't scheduled because of the visit of Biden to the region, people will read it this way. And of course, maybe the Syrian case was the main topic, of course, because of Astana's, rounds of talks. Although there were huge disagreements, I would say, between the three countries in terms of how to deal with the Syrian cases, especially from the Turkish perspectives and the military, operations inside Syria. Of course, the other side of it, it was a kind of political or military message, I would say, from Iran and Russia towards the West, which is the talks about Iran selling drones to Russia. So this is big discussion there. And of course, the threat perceptions will be different now, I would say, in Europe compared to 3 or 4 months ago, because now the drones, which was widely used in the attacks against Saudi civilian sites and in the United Arab Emirates, now might be used by Russia against some, of course, European sites and of course, specific strategic, locations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mohammed. We'll come back to the issue. I actually have a question already on the issue of the Gulf states and their policy towards Syria. But let me just go back to how both of you gentlemen cover, Iran in Washington and Riyadh, but you also spend a lot of time trying to make sense of Iranian calculations. So Norman, to you first, and then Mohammed, the same question. What did you make of the Iranian response to President Biden's trip? I was sitting there trying to monitor what the Iranian reaction was, and I sensed a sort of, almost Iranian don't care attitude, at least publicly, to the very last moment when there was a lot of talk of possibility of a regional integrated anti-air defense mechanism being perhaps a product of President Biden's visit. And that seemed to have gotten the Iranians' attention and irritated them, because that's when you started seeing sort of slogans that, Iran will retaliate in kind against anybody that sort of undermines our security, which to me suggested an Iranian anger, which we hadn't really seen in the weeks leading up to the last minute. So what did you, Norman, make of the Iranian response to President Biden's? And what would you make of that response?
I think Iran's response probably falls into two buckets. The first is that they recognize, along with the region and the United States, that this re-engagement or reset, whatever word you want to use, needs to play out in the future to see whether it's genuine, how deep and how effective it's going to be. And that there's a lot of things that could happen in and against, for and against Iran's interest in that dynamic that need time to play out. On regional security cooperation in general, of course, that's a problem for Iran, and it's not unusual that they would speak out against this. And I think you did see both in Iran and externally those people who believe that Iran should play a larger role in the region as it is, meaning as a supporter of militias, as a supporter of terrorists. Those voices also said that any sort of regional integration raises regional tensions, vice lowering them. But I think even for this second bucket, it's important to say that Iran probably recognizes that this needs to play out to see how genuine, how deep, how sophisticated, how problematic for Tehran's interest this integration will be in coming months and indeed years.
Thank you. And Mohammed, could I ask you the same question? What did you make of the Iranian reaction to President Biden's visit overall?
Well, I think Norman has covered this very well. But if, following the Iranian media from the beginning, and it's our core business in the institute, and following the Iranian media outlets and newspapers, news agencies, I would say it went into three main phases. First, just before the beginning of the visit, it was very huge media campaign against the visit, and of course, trying to present this visit as a military campaign against Iran, and of course, trying to bring the normalizations of the relation between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and of course, in terms of the new cooperation, military collaborations between the Gulf countries and Iran and Israel. During the visit, I think the Iranians started to reconsidering their positions in terms of it's not really the case. There are some differences here and there, and terms, for example, in Israel, for example, we had two different statements, one from Biden and the other from the Israeli prime minister, in terms of how to deal with Iran. One was trying to say we have to use the diplomatic tools and channels to solve the problem with Iran. The other was trying to push in the other directions, which is the military operations, or how to deal with it by force, I would say. Then in Saudi Arabia, it was very clear from the Saudi perspective there is no normalizations in terms of the relation between Saudi Arabia and Israel. There is no, of course, right now we are talking at that time, and there is no, of course, support for returning to the JCPOA as is. So this is another position. Saudi tries has its own perspective on how to deal with the Iranian, nuclear issues. And after the visit, the main campaign in Iranian media and, of course, different officials was that this visit has a very complete failure, because no normalizations in terms of relation between Saudi Arabia and Israel, one, I would say, attitude or view of Iran and how to deal with Iran. And of course, in terms of oil production, is Saudi insisted on OPEC plus. So Iran explained it in this way, that is, of course, there was a big campaign for this visit, but when Biden went back to DC, it was a complete failure for the American administration. Because whether is that true or not, but this is the Iranians try to explain it or present it in their media and different statements.
Thank you, Mohammed. Norman, I wanted to go to the nuclear issue specifically, but just to follow up on what Mohammed said, I mean, we don't know what happened, obviously, in terms of agreements behind the scenes, but in terms of the optics of it, there was no, the price of oil didn't drop overnight, if you want to go by that sort of standard. Nothing major was announced during President Biden's visit. So what would you say to that narrative that, at best, At best, what President Biden got out of this trip was his ability to fly from Israel over Saudi airspace to Jeddah. And that's pretty important in itself, but that nothing much more tangible came out of it. What would you say to people who make that argument on?
Well, I think that would be wrong. And I think we're wrong for several reasons. First, the changes that are sought in energy markets and other relationships inevitably take time to play out. There is certainly no serious foreign policy observer or no serious policy official who would expect otherwise. And that's that. Secondly, the idea that anything significant would come from this was never meant to be part of the deal. And indeed, the shape of this deal fits in many ways within the structure of the president's visit to Asia and the visit to Europe. There's a meeting of allies and partners to discuss significant issues, a series of trade, technical, and security arrangements that in essence empower experts and authorities on each side to roll out these discussions and build this new architecture in coming months. That's what these trips are supposed to do. The idea that President Biden or the Saudi king or anyone is supposed to fly in and sign a new NATO agreement, that's just preposterous. That just doesn't happen.
Yeah. And Norman, let me stay with you and move on to the sort of, I guess, the core focus of our panel today, which is what if there is no nuclear deal between Iran and the world powers? You can correct me if I'm wrong on this. I think you've been of the belief for some time that the nuclear deal is dead. If that is the case, the nuclear deal is dead. What's the plan B from an American perspective? And if you want to sort of maybe even talk about what you think plan B might look like from an Iranian perspective, and I will ask the same question of Mohammed.
So first, I believe that the strategic drivers and framework for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action no longer exist. That would include multilateral unity. That would include a leadership in Iran interested in testing the benefits of nuclear sanctions relief. That would include an Iran willing to contain its program below dangerous levels. That would include regional unity on Iran. There's a long list of foundational requirements or aspects of the original 2014-2015 deal, which simply don't exist. Secondly, Iran learned, not unsurprisingly, that although nuclear sanctions would indeed be lifted, and whatever their rhetoric says, they're well aware that the P5 fully undertook and executed their requirements. But Iran is also aware that its other activity inevitably invites further sanctions, terrorism, support for militias, missile attacks. And that, in essence, discourages foreign direct investment, foreign business, that creates problematic economic challenges with other countries. So Iran, at this point, believes that its lack of a nuclear deal does not threaten regional security. I mean, regime security. It does not threaten the ability for the leadership transition to be unrolled. It might even bring some benefits in terms of regime circling of the wagons. And Iran is now seeking, in essence, the eradication of the entire sanctions regime. You will hear Iran frequently say, we want real benefits. We want the IRGC taken off. We want a variety of things that are, in essence, it's an eradication of the entire sanctions political containment regime. Now, this said, although I believe the JCPOA is essentially dead, but a nuclear deal may be possible, but it will have far fewer benefits for the international community and the region, and it will have far fewer constraints upon Iran for a much shorter period of time. That may be achievable for some reason. But what's key is not so much the nuclear deal. And this, I think I'd like to hear Mohammed's comments on this in particular, but what do you do with the time that a nuclear deal buys? What is Iran policy of the West, of the region, of the international community beyond the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action? For too long, the JCPOA has in essence become the entirety of foreign policy regarding Iran. And you're either for it or against it, and that's pretty much the argument. So as you're moving forward into a plan B, we generally tend to look at this in some of the press rhetoric as, is it war? Is it some sort of acceleration of sanctions? Well, I actually think the plan B that would be most relevant is a genuine policy that addresses Iran's threats to its neighbors, that ties in Iran's regional equities into certainly anything that Europe or the United States consider regarding Iran. They cannot be excluded from this discussion, and they were from the JCPOA. And I think the region is right when it asks President Biden and President Macron and the next British Prime Minister, what are you going to do about Iran's threats, not only to regional civilians, Saudi men, women, and children, but to American, British, and French men, women, and children who live in the region, who seem to be somehow excluded from any policy. Hostages, of course, are out there, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the problem is, for a plan B, I'm not convinced that we have the international focus yet, particularly because of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, to allow the development of that cohesive Iran policy that addresses such terrible issues as hostage, support for militias who are now evolving into political actors, proliferation of missiles, let alone containment of Iran's nuclear program. I will close by saying I'm not sure that we can expect much from the West beyond continued statements that the nuclear deal is still on the table, but the language is fairly vague. We won't wait forever. I mean, forever is an extraordinarily long time. So we'll wait 200,000 years, but we won't wait forever. I don't really understand what that language means. And if you're sitting in the region, or if you're someone who follows the Iran security issues, you're really not out of your lane to insist that we have something more precise and more focused.
Thank you, Norman. So you put your finger on so many important points. I will get Mohammed's reaction. Mohammed, one of the things that Norman touched on, those of us who sort of have made the point that, you know, the original nuclear deal of 2015 would have survived had the Iranian side been willing to broaden the dialogue with the world powers, with regional neighbors about what Iran's agenda is in the region, which could have been a two-way street. It's not just, you know, the rest of the world putting demands to Iran. The Iranian side could have put their security concerns on the table as part of the discussion, but that never really happened, which allowed President Trump to move out of the deal in 2018. But going back to the original question, let's say this nuclear deal comes to, you know, we all recognize it to be dead. What does Plan B look like for Saudi Arabia, for the Gulf states, for the Arab world vis-a-vis Iran? And do you have the same problem as Norman was talking about before, a lack of cohesive policy in the part of certainly the Western world when it comes to how to deal with Iran on multiple fronts, not just being focused on the issue of its nuclear program, but all the other things that Iran does that is perceived or are threats to Western interests. So what does Plan B look like in a best case scenario, worst case scenario from where you're sitting, Mohammed?
Well, I think the best Plan B would be to go to the main three main files that are the nuclear issue, the Iranian behavior in the region, and of course the ballistic missile program. These are the priorities. Whether, of course, the priority of each file differs from one country to another. For example, for the United States, nuclear issue is the priority, while for Europe, I think ballistic missile program is important, and maybe the priority for that because these countries are in the reach of Iranian missiles. So for regional countries, these two files are very important, and of course have to be dealt with. But the threat that we are experiencing on a daily basis for our life details is the Iranian behavior in the region, the proxies, the militias, the attacks from the Houthis, the issues in Iraq, you know that, in Syria, Lebanon, and other places. So this is the main immediate, I would say, threat, and that has to be dealt with. So we know also in the region, and of course there is a big argument in the West that it would be very difficult to reach a comprehensive deal that including these three files. And I subscribe to that, but that doesn't mean we have to just ignore it because it's difficult. What about the JCPOA took a year or year and a half? What if we have 2 years or 3 years to have a comprehensive deal that include the interests of everybody, including the Iranian people, the concerns of all regional countries, international players, to force, of course, Iran to come back to the table of negotiations. Of course, Iran is now very happy and very lucky, I would say, with the the Ukraine-Russian crisis. That's the focus shifted from Iran to east of Europe, of course, and the American administration wants to just conclude the JCPOA or the entering the JCPOA. The problem is that we shouldn't try what we had before and it was a failure. That is the JCPOA at its in its current version has to be improved. Of course, we support the reaching an agreement with Iran. We support the diplomatic and political solution with Iran. We want a very good relation with Iran. Of course, the Crown Prince said it more than once lately in his opening remarks in the summit in Jeddah. He said very clear that we are extending our hands to Iran. I want to have a normal relation with Iran, but Iran has to change its course and, of course, behavior in the region. Of course, we had three options. I have written an article before in this specific points. That is, we have first to have sanctions, more sanctions, to have a military confrontation, or third option is tit for tat. The second one was military confrontation. Nobody supported or subscribed to that. Specifically regional countries, they don't want more wars in the region. It's enough is enough for that. Tit for tat, military operation here and there is in the benefit for Iran for supporting the domestic front and, of course, playing on the their main strategy that the enemy is around the corner and I have to deal with this enemy. So that is support, get more support for their political system inside the country. So what about sanctions? In sanctions, of course, we have enough sanctions. So everybody would say that, lots of sanctions. The problem is not with the quantity rather than implementation. Of course, we remember during Trump administration, Iranian oil export dropped, declined to 200,000 barrels per day. Right now, Iran sells more than 1.3 million barrel per day, So no sanction has been lifted. So what happened? There is no monitoring, there is no implementation for sanctions. And this is very easy, made it very easy for Iran to do its business. And I think it's the best environment for Iran right now to not have a deal, but do not have a very heavy implemented sanctions against the political system. And of course, now they are talking about, keep the IRGC as, foreign, what do you call it? What is the MFA, is it?
Foreign terrorist
foreign FTA, okay. But you have to relieve or to make it easy for Khatam al-Anbiya to do business. In my opinion, Khatam al-Anbiya is more important than IRGC because this is the main arm for IRGC to do business and to go around the sanctions. So I think that is important than just saying IRGC. So that is the discussion we have right now. I just, Alexa, I wrote an article about the relation. And I think in terms of how to roadmap in terms of the relation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And I tried to be very sincere in that, to try to just throw it there and try to see the Iranian reaction to that. If there is sincere in terms of, Iran is sincere in terms of rebuilding the relation with the regional countries. Of course, there was miscalculus from the beginning from Iran. That is, they thought, of course, if we ignore regional countries, especially GCC countries, and we reach a deal with P5, what they call the great power, superpower, the GCC, especially United States and Europe, the GCC have no option but to follow and to agree on that. And then we can discuss other issues with the regional countries. That was a very miscalculus from the beginning. Of course, Iran recognized that and tried to come back to the deal through the regional countries. But it was, in my opinion, so late because of the war in Yemen and the attacks against Saudi Arabia. The regional countries do not trust Iran. We have to work hard to build their trust with Iran. So therefore, I think if there is the plan B, it should be to bring Iran back to the table of negotiation with, of course, hope and time framework.
Yeah.
And with, okay, we can, some sanctions should be lifted, but there is the limit for that in terms of the progress in the other two files.
Right.
I think that will be a very win-win situation for everybody. I acknowledge that it's very difficult, but it is not impossible.
Thank you, Mohammed. Norman, I want to make sure we get some of the questions in. One question that I think you'll be best poised to answer is on the issue of perceptions in the Gulf and the sort of issue of rising China. And essentially the question, if in summary, asks, why is there such a fear in the Gulf states that just because the United States is now more concerned about Chinese actions, that means a net loss in American interest or commitment to its Gulf partners? How would you reassure the Gulf partners that just because Washington is focused more on China, that doesn't mean less commitment to the Middle East, to the Gulf states, Arab world?
So I think there's certainly a lot of discussion of this in social media and the press, but it's often sort of skewed towards the sensational or skewed towards the to the headline that might summarize what you just said through the question. The United States position on China has been fairly consistent. The Gulf states should have normal and robust economic, cultural, social ties with China, political ties, just as they do with any other country. We have significant problems with certain aspects of IT and military sales, in large part because the integration of those two elements into the existing architecture would allow China to, in essence, steal and spy on American technology in the region. China has a vast and robust network of cyber espionage to both enable its own industries and to counter Western defenses. And frankly, it's difficult for us to easily tolerate a scenario where Western military technology is made accessible to China, and then that access costs us lives in a future Pacific conflict. And our Gulf partners understand this and they wish to be cooperative, and it's a very reasonable conversation. China, however, is part of the problem. Mohammed has correctly cited that Iran sells about 1.3 million barrels of oil a day. Much of this goes to China. The money that does make it back from those sales goes to Iran. That money is funding the missile industry and it is funding the militia industry, not in its entirety, but it's part of the general budget that funds those two organizations. If a missile lands in Saudi Arabia, it's not unreasonable to think that some Chinese money has enabled that missile to have been given to the Houthis. It's a simple fact of basic economics. China, from the rationale of region of the Gulf leaders with whom I've spoken, is also essentially indifferent to the region's security problems. It's true that they've had some diplomatic discussions and have offered to increase the number of, I think, some peacekeepers in the region. But China's position basically is if Iranian missiles strike Abu Dhabi or strike Riyadh, they're not playing a part of this. You will have Gulf voices rightfully and reasonably say to the United States and other Western partners, what was your response to this? But you actually don't have those same voices turning to China saying, why are you silent on this as well, despite your robust relations with Iran? So China, in essence, benefits from this neutral position where on trade issues, it's a robust partner, but it's utterly indifferent to the security problems because involving themselves in same would require that they pick and choose among two partners that they rely on for geo-commercial and geo-economic success.
Thank you, Norman. Mohammed, a question for you. The question says, evidence shows that the Syrian-Iranian strategic alliance is solid. What makes those Gulf countries that normalize relations with Damascus think that they can weaken that alliance? And I guess you can ask the question, or I'm asking the question, was that an intention? I mean, did for example, UAE resume diplomatic relations with the intention of weakening Iran's hand? Was that ever on the cards? What do you think?
Well, of course, there is theory, I would say, in some of Arab countries that we shouldn't leave Syria to Iran, and we have to contain Syria and bring it back to the Arab world. And that is by, in a way, normalizing the relation, or normalizing the relation with the Syrian regime, although they have their own problems with Bashar al-Assad. But if it's in the limit, I mean, if any minimum political or diplomatic ties, whether that's wrong or correct or not, I think they thought Bashar al-Assad wants to get rid of Iranians. Of course, it would be very difficult, but it's never be late. And of course, they supported the political system in Syria. Iran supported the political system in Iran in Syria to survive the revolution. But of course, the Iranian behavior inside Syria, whether in in terms of spreading the ideology, in terms of spreading Shiism or Twilfers, Shiism, or of course trying to use Syria for whether spreading the drugs through IRGC, and of course the King of Jordan talked about that in his late visit to US. So let's at least have a relation with Syria, at least with the political system in Syria. Of course, there is a very big campaign among the Arabs that to bring Syria back to the Arab League. Saudi Arabia is not in favor of this right now. It's still early. Syria has to do lots of reforms inside the country until they can rejoin the Arab League. I think trying to send messages to the Syrian political system that if you can minimize or declining the relation with Iran, we can support you in terms, of course, rebuilding Syria. One of the main questions: Iran doesn't have the money, but we can do it. What can you give us in return? So some points, whether they are achievable or not, but I think in terms of international relations, you have to give it a try from one or two players and see the result. How would it look like? How can we continue in this engagement with the Syrian regime? Right. I don't think Syria or Bashar al-Assad can disconnect itself from Iran right now. Mm-hmm. We have seen, of course, Syrian Minister of Foreign Affairs was in Iran last week, in the margin of course of the summit, and it was humiliation, I would say, for Syria, because they were not included in the discussions. It was just bilateral press conference, and that was it's not good for Syria and the history of Syria, I would say.
Right. Thank you, Mohammed. We have a number of questions that sort of touch on the issue of essentially Abraham Accords, relations between the State of Israel and the Gulf states. And both of you, please take this and take it in the direction that you see best. The question is, how does, I guess, this Abraham Accord, this new relationship between Israel and countries like UAE and Bahrain, how does that help stabilize and if so, how does it stabilize the security situation in the environment? And as Mohammed, you touched on it, you said, war is not something anybody in the region wants. I think the one option you reference the most is a better implementations of the sanctions regime to make the Iranians pay attention. So you actually pay a price if you're Iran for not having that diplomatic conversation. Officials from UAE during President Biden's visit said that the country of UAE for sure is not interested in joining an anti-Iran military bloc. Takes me, Norman, to the question. So what do you make of this Israel-Gulf relations on the security front? Clearly, Iran was a factor, but can it remain a factor if Iran-Israeli tensions increase? Would the Gulf states have second thoughts about where they are?
I think the way to look at this again is in two different buckets. The first is these remain early days for the Abraham Accords. Relationships between the regional actors are improving each month. They're focused mainly on trade, medical cooperation, technological innovation sharing, people-to-people issues, That's all wonderful. That's exactly what we should support for the region to be able to better understand each other and to work together and to develop their own solutions that suit their own requirements without other parties who may not be as familiar coming into that. When it comes to security engagement, this is something that it's a great headline grabber. It's a great social media point, but this is hugely complicated. As someone who has spent a lot of years on working air defense integration and other issues, this will take a very, very long time to play out. However, Iran's threats, Iran's actions in the region are accelerating that process. If Iran is Mohammed, who says many wise things, and I always learn from my engagement with Mohammed, but as Mohammed talked about Iran's actions with the region years ago, if Iran had just used the JCPOA to open a genuine new chapter with the region of political discussion and normalization, I think it would have slowed the Abraham Accords. But if Iran is going to constantly attack the region through proxies with missiles, drones, and other emerging technologies, it's perfectly reasonable to assume that these states who want to protect the men, women, and children in their countries are going to turn to someone else and say, how do we work together to do this? And I think for this reason, it's less that the integration is provoking Iran, but Iran is actually accelerating the security relationship, which will take a while to develop, primarily for technical purposes over time.
Right. Thank you, Norbert. Mohammed, the same question to you, and I'm linking it to another question what we have received here. And the question is, what if there is war, essentially? What if there is no nuclear deal and Israel decides to take action on its own against the Iranian nuclear sites because it feels that that's the only option left to it? Where would that put the Gulf states, given the geographic vicinity and repeated Iranian threats that if anybody attacks Iran, if countries, for example, in the Gulf provide assistance of any kind to the Israelis, they will be seen as legitimate targets. Where would that put, and this is Iranian rhetoric mostly, I think, but maybe it's not. And how does the Gulf states look at all this?
Thank you. I think it's so. Just to go back to Abraham Accord, which is, of course, mainly United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. Of course, Saudi Arabia didn't, following this, and of course, for one main reason, which is the Arab Initiative. That was a Saudi proposal in 2002 in Beirut, the Arab Summit in Beirut. Saudi doesn't want to, put this huge proposal on the second level. They always keep, re-emphasizing the importance of the Arab Initiative in Beirut 2002. Of course, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain have their own reasons to go in that direction. But I think for Saudi Arabia, talking about its importance in the region, in the Islamic world, and for many reasons, the Tohalimas, they cannot join this right now unless there is something in return from Israel in terms of the Palestinian state. It's very clear from Saudi Arabia. The solution, two-state solution, is the best and the only solution from the Saudi perspective. What if there is a war? I hope there will be no war, of course. No. It will be lose-lose for everybody. But of course, Saudi and the Gulf country will be in the road of the crossfire between Israel, if there is an attack from Israeli side against Iran. And of course, we would see Iranian attacks against Saudi Arabia, Gulf countries, and they will try to justify that. The regional Arab countries and the Gulf countries will try their best to defend their countries, and they are capable of doing that. But of course, there will be a huge damage in both sides. What if there's huge new refugees from Iran? Will the Gulf countries can contain that? Of course, talking about Corona issue, talking about the slowdown of the international, economy, talking about crisis in Europe. I think it's very wrong to talk about this or to think it's a choice right now, unless regional countries were forced to defend themselves, and I hope not. We shouldn't reach this point. But Iran has to think again about it. Of course, if there is an international coalition, if there is a regional coalition against Iran,
Right.
the political system in Iran and not Iranians will pay a lot of price in that regard. And of course, there will be second strike in that regard. The regional countries try to contain that. But I'm not an expert in military operations, but my conclusion in this, let's avoid military confrontation. Let's try to solve it politically and diplomatically. And Iran has to think about the price. Iran now is trying to get the benefit from the GCPOA, the economic benefit. What if there is a war? How can Iran afford that? It's a huge question. And I think the answer is very clear in Tehran.
I really want you to be able to continue in the more positive thought where you were going, but I have a question that I think I'm afraid we'll take it back a little bit in the negative direction. But the question basically says, if there is no nuclear deal, the potential of a nuclear arms race among the Gulf countries. Could you quickly, but to the extent that you want to comment on that, would Saudi Arabia want to become a nuclear state?
Absolutely. If Iran was allowed to produce weapons, Saudi has no choice but to follow. And not only Saudi Arabia, we'll talk about Turkey, we'll talk about other countries, Egypt and other countries. It's not in the benefit of anybody. And I think the world has to stop Iran. Right. Otherwise, they have to think about the balance of power in the region. And every country will, unfortunately, there will be a shift in terms of money spending, as Iran now is doing in military. But in the region, we try to spend our money in, improving the infrastructure, in terms of human resources and education, health. If there is arms races, the whole budget will be shifted to the other direction, and that will be a huge damage for everything. But it will be the only choice. Right. And I hope by forcing Iran not to go in that direction, we will give life, I would say, to the region.
Right. Thank you, Mohammed. Norman, we have just about over 5 minutes left, so let's have the last round. Obviously, if you want to react to anything you just heard Mohammed say on the nuclear arms race potential and so forth. But I had one final question for you, Norman, and this is something that links to an article that I think Mohammed was referencing earlier that he did for Arab News, in which he kind of points out that the issue of Yemen is critical in helping Iranian Saudi diplomacy ever work. If that is going to happen, then there needs to be some kind of understanding over Yemen. Could you see a trilateral momentum here? The U.S. being involved in the issue of Yemen with the Saudis, and somehow finding a way to talk to the Iranians as well, as one way that's non-nuclear related, but as a way of de-escalating in the region. Your comments there, please.
I think effectively, no.
Right.
Doesn't mean that some sort of engagement with Iran on behalf of the United States, likely through Europeans, isn't possible. Indeed, it's happened several times in the past. But Iran has generally responded in a very unhelpful way on all of these discussions. In essence, what Iran will say is, we have no involvement in Yemen, despite the fact that their ambassador to Sana'a is a terrorist for all intents and purposes, and an IRGC officer, and has been there for years. But we could help over time if you give us a powerful voice in the political dynamic of Yemen. That's just wrong. You don't cede the fate of the Yemeni people who need to decide their own fate to the Iranian government, which has not had a significant voice in Yemen, with a few minor exceptions, since the 7th century itself. I think the issue becomes, how do you support a Yemeni dynamic where Yemeni actors talk to themselves and build a polity that allow them to address Houthi aggression enabled by Iran, funded by Iran, trained by Iran. And in some ways, the other powers can certainly help on this and facilitate this. And Tim Lenderking, our ambassador in this process, is superb, but it's not our place. Now, for Saudi Arabia and the Arab coalition, it's a very different situation. It's on their border. The Houthis have fired hundreds of missiles and drones in an attack campaign unprecedented in international history, which is essentially ignored by the international community. And we have somehow ceded to Saudi Arabia, in large part, the ability, the requirement to defend hundreds of thousands of nationals from many countries, to include its own men, women, and children, and then criticize them for how they conduct the fight to defend their own country. I think what we need to do is to have a different paradigm as to how the Yemeni conflict needs to play out, respecting Saudi and Gulf security equities, and allowing and empowering the Yemeni people to sort this out, and keeping Iran as far the heck away from this as possible.
Right. Thank you, Norman. Mohammed, you almost get the last word. We have about 3 or 4 minutes left, but please do react to anything you heard Norman just say. And actually, I wanted to sort of highlight something you wrote in that opinion piece you did for Arab News, which I thought it was interesting. You call Iran's negotiating strategy, and I assume you're referring to the 5 rounds of talks in Baghdad, as complicated and slow moving. Tell us more about why it's complicated and slow moving, and how deliberate is that? What is it Iran wants to get? I mean, the Iranian economy is literally on the brink. Why would time and playing for time and delaying tactics, why on earth does that serve Iranian interests right now?
Well, Iran, it's very clear that from the round number 1, they want to jump to the diplomatic relation with Saudi normalization, for normalization, or at least to have diplomatic ties with Saudi Arabia, reopening the embassies, which is almost impossible. That is because Saudi Arabia and the other side tries to, okay, let's talk about the concerns, the problem we have, and then if we can reach a conclusion, positive conclusion, let's then move to normalizations. The Iranians want to do it the other way around. There are lots of phases. Because there is a lack of trust between the two sides. To rebuild the trust, you have to work hard in doing that. And of course, what I suggested, the 3 levels of the negotiations with the Iranians, with the track 2, track 1.25, and then track 1. Unfortunately, it seems to me that Iranian political system doesn't want to go in that direction, although there are some media reflections in my article in Iranian media, but still it's not really clear. The complications of this is Yemen issue, 1. Second is Iran never ever acknowledges its interference in the other countries' internal affairs, which is a huge problem. Everybody knows that Iran is interfering, and we have lots of evidence, and of course very clear, but they just rejecting that. How can I deal with this? How can we reach a solid point, on solid ground in which we can build our relations for the future? This is the problem. Of course, Iran can find lots of excuses that at least justifications, whether right or not, just to move forward in terms of building a relation with Saudi Arabia and other countries. Of course, just yesterday, I think Abdullahian was talking about Kuwait rescinding its ambassador. The United Arab Emirates will send its ambassador soon. And he talked about another coming meeting with Saudi Arabia on a diplomatic level, which is okay, but I'm not sure if that's true or not. Anyway, of course, I am in favor of retaining the relation, a normalization with Iran, but there is lots of and there are lots of points. If that can be achieved, why not? Iran is a neighboring country. We have lots of shared value, history, culture, and of course, it's a benefit for Iran to be engaged, integrated in the regional economy in terms of Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, lots of options and opportunities for Iran. Right. It's better, and Iran can use its own soft power, I would say, in terms of advertising the country. We have lots of things to talk about in this regard, but just to make it very short, I think Iran has to rethink about the way it reaches out to neighboring countries.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Mohammed. You got the last word. I want to thank Mohammed and Norman for taking time out in busy days that you have, two of the smartest minds out there on the issue of U.S. policy toward the Gulf, Iranian relations with the Gulf states. So thank you very much for taking the time to come in. And thank all the audience members who watched us and for your wonderful questions. And, there are, as you said, Mohammed, a lot of ifs. But let's just hope that if there's a will, there is a way out of it, even though things seem a bit dark and impossible to fix. But hopefully, if there is a political will, as I think both of you pointed out, Mohammed and Norman, there might be a better future going forward in Iran's relations with the Gulf state. With that said, I thank you again and wish you all a wonderful weekend. Thanks very much. Bye-bye from me.
Thank you.